Over the last few months of being in the A Song of Ice and Fire fandom, one character, more than any of the others, that has stood out to me as being very misunderstood as far as the general consensus with the fandom is Sansa Stark. And I say that as someone who, when I first watched the TV show a few years back, didn't care for her character at all. I didn't understand why people liked her. I found her naive, irritating, too obsessed with fairy tales and things that weren't real, and just compared to other characters like Arya, who was bold and very brave, or Jon, who's doing cool things with Ghost north of the Wall, or Daenerys and her dragons, Sansa just felt really boring and quite insufferable at points, especially in those earlier seasons. But the more time that I spent with the series, and especially after I read the books, I slowly but surely started to realize how unbelievably brilliant her arc is. And at this point, I think she might have one of the best arcs in the entire story. I think a major reason why people don't immediately appreciate Sansa Stark's character is because she isn't written like your typical protagonist. Her growth isn't flashy and in your face, it's not very loud, it's a very slow burn that happens underneath the surface, and you have to really pay attention to specifically the way that she is thinking in order to understand it. And after thinking about this character for a few months, the best way that I can describe her arc throughout A Song of Ice and Fire is that of a reverse fairy tale. In most fairy tales, specifically the classic ones, we start with a girl who has nothing. A girl who is usually poor, unrecognized, not really loved properly, and for the most part she just lives in a world that doesn't understand her, and she suffers a lot. But through a mix of that suffering, through kindness, possibly through the help of magic, and romance, she eventually becomes a queen or a princess or a high lord. Her circumstances in this world end up changing because she is a good person and deserves more because of that. Think about Cinderella, someone who begins the story in rags, cleaning floors with no family and no real power, but by the end of the story, she's married to the prince. She's royalty. And even more important than that, she is very, very loved. And Sansa's story is just like that, but flipped on its head. Because Sansa Stark doesn't start her story at the bottom. She starts at the top, at the height of her happiness, at the best time in her life. In Book 1, she starts off the story the daughter of the Warden of the North, a true-born Stark of Winterfell. She lives in this really cool castle that is really warm, she wears really nice clothes, she eats really good food, she is really beautiful, and everyone around her admires and loves her. Not only that, but she has this really cool direwolf companion, and very quickly she ends up engaged to a prince. She's everything that a fairy tale princess would end up being at the end of her journey. But crucially, because she's still a young girl, she wants more. She wants an even higher dream. She wants to marry her beautiful prince and be loved by the entire realm, because Winterfell is all she's ever known and it's not enough anymore. She wants to live like the high fantasies and crazy songs that she's heard her entire life. And this is exactly why such a massive portion of the fandom doesn't like this character, because when you first meet her, she is really quite annoying by design. She is an immature child that's lacking any sort of real perspective about the world. But that changes, because her life takes a very tragic and cruel turn. Within just a few chapters of leaving Winterfell, everything begins to fall apart. Her direwolf lady the very embodiment of her innocence and ties to Winterfell, is killed because of a situation Sansa tried to lie her way through. Her father is then beheaded right in front of her by her prince that's supposed to be her knight in shining armor. Her sister just randomly vanishes one day, and then she is taken hostage, used as blackmail, and then beaten physically, mentally, and emotionally for the better part of 2 years. And somehow, this just keeps getting worse for her. Her 2 younger brothers are presumed dead, burned to death by Theon Greyjoy, who was kind of like a brother to her. Then, her mother and eldest brother are both murdered in one of the most deplorable moments in Westerosi history, the Red Wedding. And then, just when it seems like she might be free from Joffrey's torment, she's forced to marry Tyrion Lannister, just a different lion, someone else who is still responsible for the death and destruction of her family. And then, after the Purple Wedding, she's framed for the murder of Joffrey and made one of the most wanted people in Westeros. And it's important to note here that this all occurs before she is 15 years old. But because Sansa doesn't respond with the typical depiction of rage or violence, specifically because she's not really a physical kind of person, a lot of readers end up dismissing her growth because they don't see the strength in her subtlety. Sansa Stark, at the end of the day, is a survivor. And that's not a small feat in a world like this. For the most part, she keeps her head down, but her eyes throughout the entire story are always open. She is constantly listening, constantly learning, and constantly adapting to any new person or thing in her environment. And slowly but surely, even subconsciously at first, she starts to understand how people work on the ground level. Not just through the words that they say, but through what they aren't saying, through the game that they are playing behind the scenes. She ends up studying characters like Cersei, who tried to mold her in a specific way, but ended up changing her into something else entirely. But it's not just Cersei. She studies Marjorie, Olenna, Tywin, Littlefinger, Tyrion, every single person of any amount of power that she sees and interacts with, she learns something new from. And what makes this all the more terrifying is the fact that Sansa Stark is learning how to leverage her own traits that she has to better her position. For example, she knows that people view her as soft and beautiful. In understanding this, she leans into her femininity, letting the world see her as soft and useless, letting the people see her grace and her politeness and her beauty, and using that as an outer shell, as armor, while underneath she is playing her own game. She has this really phenomenal line in one of her later chapters where she says she was once porcelain, then ivory, and now steel, and that line symbolizes her entire arc throughout all the 5 books. And because of this, by the time she gets to the Vale and is pretending to be Elaine Stone, she is no longer a reactive character who is a victim of the actionary characters. In a very interesting way, it's almost like she's training. She's beginning to craft a new identity, one that doesn't just survive, but is learning to control the game itself. A person that isn't being manipulated, but doing the manipulating. A person who smiles sweetly while also calculating her next move behind someone's back. And what makes this all the more interesting is she's good at it. And what makes this all the more interesting is that she's good at it. Unbelievably good. All of a sudden, she's starting to understand how to really play the Game of Thrones at a high level, being able to keep on a level with Littlefinger, who is one of the most intelligent characters in the entire series. And this is precisely why I think Sansa Stark is going to be one of the most terrifying characters if and when we get the Winds of Winter. Because everyone is underestimating her, and no one is really seeing her coming. The Lords of Westeros don't fear a quiet young girl with pretty words and good manners. But they should, because Sansa Stark is learning how to play them all. In being underestimated, she has leverage. And I honestly believe that by the end of the series, she's going to use all that pain, all that loss, all that newfound hidden strength to carve out her own place in the world. Now, unfortunately, there is no way for her to get Winterfell back just the way it was, due to the fact that that version of her life is gone. But I believe she will win something back through reclaiming agency in her own story. She's going to become someone powerful in her own right, not because she married the right person or had magical powers, but because throughout all of this, she survived, adapted, and outlasted every single person who tried to kill her. Sansa Stark's story is the opposite of a fairy tale. She starts with everything: a loving family, noble status, safety, the dream life. But she loses all of it. But through that loss, she becomes something far more real than any fairy tale. She becomes a powerful character, forged by the cruelty of others and the silence of oneself. And by the end of it all, she might just be one of the last people standing. Not because she was the loudest, or the strongest, or the most clever at the start, but because she endured the entire time. And just to wrap up this video, what I love the most about Sansa Stark's arc and where she ends up is at the start of the story, she doesn't really feel very northern. She feels very southern and wants to go to the south, but by her final chapter in A Dance with Dragons, I feel she really embodies the words of House Stark. Winter is coming. She has this coldness and this somberness and this level-headedness to her that I only feel Ned Stark had, and I just love that so much. Sansa Stark is one of the most underrated characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, specifically because her arc is so unique when you compare it to not only other characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, but just other characters throughout prominent fantasy media. And if you are someone who feels the way that I used to feel about Sansa Stark, not really liking the character, I encourage you to go back and reread some of her earlier and later chapters with this newfound perspective, because I promise you, when you keep the ideas I'm presenting here in mind, all of a sudden this character who flies under the radar becomes one of the most interesting and lovable characters in the entire series. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have an amazing day.